Senator for Ohio,
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask dispense with the quorum call if we're in a quorum.
without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, I joined some of my colleagues at the White House yesterday to talk with President Biden and Vice President Harris about what it will take to make real progress against the pandemic and to make a real difference in people's lives. Our country is in the middle, as we know, of a once-in-a-generation crisis, and this is our opportunity to deliver for them. Yesterday, I came to the floor to talk about the need for direct stimulus checks and for rental assistance and tax cuts for working families, and to use the Defense Production Act to get more people vaccinated more quickly. Today, I'm here to talk about the critical help in this plan and the Biden plan for our nation's veterans and their families. Since the beginning of the pandemic, 9,300 veterans have died of COVID-19. Right now, at least 9,000 veterans are sick with this virus. Our plan would ensure that frontline VA employees have the protective equipment they need to continue to do their job every day as they care for our veterans. It would help us get more veterans and VA workers vaccinated. We know that nothing's more critical now than getting vaccines into people's arms, especially as we face new, more contagious variants. So far, VA has provided some 800,000 initial doses of vaccines to veterans and employees. Additional funding would ramp up both vaccine distribution and COVID treatments for those who answer the call to service. In order to continue to meet our nation's and veterans' medical needs, VA has shifted to new methods of caring, including expanded telehealth. We know the need for expanded capabilities will only continue to grow. VA will need additional funding to meet veterans' needs where they are so they can stay home, so they can stay safe wherever possible, and provide them with the health care that they've earned. VA has in too many cases, VA has been able to freeze bills, if you will, to veterans who accrued co-payment and fees for care during the pandemic. That was the right move. In discussions with the VA medical center directors in Ohio, I said we should use as much flexibility as possible to waive these debts. Some of these co-pays and fees amounted to $2,000 for some vets. For them to have the bill come due right after the holidays was cruel, as we were seeing cases spike and uncertainty continue. We know that any large medical bill can be a shock, and during these uncertain times, we should work to lessen that burden, especially to take away that stress on our veterans. That's why our plan would provide co-payment relief to all veterans as the pandemic continues. If a vet was charged a VA copay, regardless of whether the care was COVID-related or not, that copay would be waived. It would reimburse veterans who've already paid their bills, to the VA. I thank Chairman Tester and Chairman Schatz for their work on this plan. Many of our nation's veterans on a fixed income, it will mean so much to them to not have to worry about another medical bill. Last week, Dennis McDonough came before our Veterans Affairs Committee. He's the nominee for the VA to be VA Secretary. I asked him about a proposed program that would require military borrowers who are coming out of COVID-19 mortgage forbearance to pay back their missed payments with interest within 10 years. The VA program would be more expensive than what other federal mortgage programs are offering. Think about that. We charge veterans more than others through this program. It makes no sense. It would make it more likely that VA borrowers will fall behind on these new higher monthly payments. He gave me his word that he would look into the program and work with me to ensure no VA homeowner is left with worse option than borrowers in other federally backed loan programs. We're about to have new leadership at the VA, leadership that understands that the decisions made in Washington impact veterans in Portland, Maine, in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Chillicothe. Veterans in Cleveland and Toledo don't care how the Senate passes this. They don't care about regular order or reconciliation. They just want the help that we need. That's why we need to go big. Veterans care about when they get the vaccine, when they can get an appointment with their mental health professional, whether their VA providers have enough protective equipment so they can continue to do their jobs. So I ask colleagues of both parties, let's get this done. No time for squibbling over Senate procedure. The Senate's used these fast-tracking budget measures over and over in times far less dire, far less stressful than what we face today, Mr. President. That's why it's so important that we just go back and remember what Senator McConnell had no problem in 2017 during the leader's first term, had no problems pouring money into corporations' coffers with their tax cut. There was no emergency. The only emergency was that lobbyists were lined up out in front of Senator McConnell's office asking for a tax cut for their corporation. Now, Senator McConnell claims he can't afford to help everyone else. We didn't win World War II by worrying about whether or not we could afford it. General Eisenhower didn't call President Roosevelt in early June 1944 and say, do we have enough dollars for D-Day? Of course not. Our veterans know that. They know we're in a global crisis. They know we've marshaled all our vast resources and talent to rise to meet it. Then we grew the economy after the war from the middle class out. We paid down the debt with rising wages. This is a war too. America elected new leaders because they were tired of a president and a majority leader who refused to treat this war with the same urgency. People are tired of being told we can't do it, we can't afford it, we've done enough. Let's aim higher in this country. Let's deliver for the people we serve. Let's come together. Let's pass this. Let's make a real difference in Americans' lives. Thank you, Mr. President.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator for Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored here to follow my good friend.
Does the senator wish to dispense with the quorum call?
I am so sorry. I ask that the mandatory quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
I'm honored to follow my colleague, Senator Brown, on an issue that should be close to all of our hearts, which is strengthening our VA so that it can provide more assistance, more help, more support for our nation's heroes. I had the great opportunity last Sunday to spend time at the West Haven VA hospital, where literally thousands of vaccines are being administered hour by hour to our veterans. Around 25% of the veterans of Connecticut eligible to receive it have vaccinations administered to them. That 25% is way above the 10% of the entire population of our state. And it is a great beginning under the leadership of Al Montoya at the West Haven VA and his remarkable team. Our nation's heroes are receiving the vaccinations they need and deserve, more than 8,000 already, and the staff of the VA, 2,500, have received vaccinations. Not all want it, but the VA is reaching out to them, literally person by person, to ask them to come and assure them that this vaccine is safe and effective. Most assuredly, it is. So the VA is moving forward, but much more needs to be done. And a lot of that VA target population is among the most vulnerable by virtue of age, by virtue of pre-existing conditions, by virtue of their service and exposure and comorbidities. And that is why this plan, the American Rescue Plans, distributing COVID-19 vaccines to veterans is so critically important. 9,000 VA patients have died of coronavirus, although 1 million nationwide of our veterans have received vaccination. There are many, many more who have not. And these vaccines are reaching the arms of veterans, but the VA system needs support and investment to do its job. Likewise, this pandemic has imposed mental health burdens on our veterans. The veterans who are shut in, likewise, the veterans who have no homes, veterans in all parts of the country have been stressed and strained just like everyone else. In fact, maybe more so. And medical health services available through telemedicine are more important than ever, but they alone are not going to accomplish this purpose. So again, what we've seen in Connecticut through the CBOX and what's accomplished through telemedicine, what is provided through counseling, all shows additional investment will produce even better care for our veterans. A lot of our veterans have debts, some of them medical debts. They need help. And this American Rescue Plan provides assistance for them. I've been a longtime advocate of extending VA healthcare to more veterans. I'm proud this plan would allow struggling veterans to get more healthcare at the VA, but relieving veterans from the burden of medical costs is not enough. We need to deliver stimulus payments, unemployment insurance, aid to small businesses, so that we can lift the broader economic pain brought on by COVID-19. Veterans are part of our general population. Those general programs are part of what we owe to them. All of these programs need more oversight and more vigorous scrutiny as we go forward to prevent the kind of waste or delay that we've seen sometimes in veterans programs. That's why the funds for the VA would be directed in part to oversight by the VA Office of the Inspector General. Through oversight by the Inspector General in combination with rigorous congressional oversight, we can ensure that these dollars are being spent effectively in accordance with congressional priorities in a way that best supports our veterans. A broader plan is also necessary, a broader infrastructure plan that will, for example, reconstruct and rehabilitate that West Haven hospital. It dates from the 1950s. It has a new shell, but its structure is aging and aged, degrading, and sometimes in some ways decrepit. The VA's done a great job of sustaining and maintaining it, but this reconstruction is absolutely necessary. The capital investment must be made. And so our VA facilities, our ports and airports, roads and bridges, all are in need of vital repair and reconstruction. That is part of the broader plan that must be undertaken. Priority must be given to those VA facilities. Just a few months ago, we suffered in Connecticut a tragic accident when 2 workers at that VA hospital were killed while they were doing maintenance. It was unnecessary, avoidable, preventable, but it demonstrates the weaknesses and defects in the construction that remains in that hospital. It must be remediated and improved. And the best way to do it is through a new building, not just a new exterior, not just cosmetic work, but truly an infrastructure program that keeps faith with our veterans. There is no excuse for delaying this COVID-19 rescue plan. Delay is unconscionable. Time is not on our side. We need decisive, bold, big action to meet the needs that our veterans have and all of the American people have in this time of unique, painful, and continuing crisis. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin,
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey,
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to make the case that we should invest $10 billion in the prevention and defeat of COVID-19 in the foreign assistance portion of this budget resolution. For so long as COVID-19 is anywhere, it can spread everywhere, directly threatening our national security, our economy, and the health and safety of the American people. COVID-19 has devastated the world. To date, there have been nearly 103 million confirmed cases worldwide. More than 2 million people have died, including over 450,000 in the United States. The lockdowns necessitated by the pandemic have triggered the worst recession since the Great Depression. We must join with our partners and allies around the globe to end the scourge once and for all. Now, with so many Americans shattered by the death, disruption, and economic devastation unleashed by coronavirus, I am sure more than a few would question why we should bother spending any resources in the global fight against COVID-19, let alone $10 billion. The simple answer is COVID-19 knows no borders. The pandemic didn't start here, but it came here. The world is in a race against COVID-19, and we cannot lose. For the longer we allow this virus to spread, the more it will mutate into new strains. And the more that it mutates into new strains, the greater the threat to the efficacy of our vaccines and our ability to rebuild our economy and restore our way of life. This $10 billion investment will ramp up American efforts to fight COVID-19 and stop new variants before they reach our shores and cost more American lives. It will fund humanitarian assistance to respond to the suffering inflicted by COVID-19 and channel resources to international organizations charged with and are responding to these challenges and preventing further spread. And it will support the global race to develop new vaccines. As Dr. Anthony Fauci publicly stated last month, we have to start work now preparing additional vaccines to deal with new and virulent strains of COVID-19. This will require investment both at home and abroad. In addition to our own efforts, we must invest in international research and development and support technology transfers so that vaccines capable of protecting us from future variants are produced and made available quickly around the world. The package also includes funding for global health programs that strengthen health systems in developing countries. As we've learned firsthand, COVID-19 can overwhelm even the most robust of healthcare systems. For countries with poorer public health infrastructure, the challenge is exponentially harder. And the longer we allow COVID-19 to ravage health systems around the globe, the longer it will remain a threat to the United States. The resolution will also help us protect 2 decades worth of investments to combat the spread of HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria through the Global Fund. Specifically, the resolution ensures that life-saving treatments for those 3 deadly diseases continues. It also provides resources to support the Global Fund's newly developed COVID-19 response mechanism, allowing countries to better prevent, care for, and treat this disease. Mr. President, it's hard to recapture the scale of the suffering unleashed by this pandemic, but here's what we know. The number of people facing famine-like conditions around the world has doubled. Child malnutrition and death rates are on the rise. Through this resolution, we will be able to address the pandemic's toll on the most vulnerable, including children and refugees, by funding organizations such as the World Food Program and UNICEF. It will also enable us to help confront dramatically increased rates of violence against women and girls, what the United Nations has called the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. And it will provide urgently needed funding for the World Health Organization, which the Biden administration rejoined on the president's first day in office. We cannot forfeit our seat at the table to other countries who do not share our values or our interests. We must engage and we must lead. Finally, the resolution will support ongoing State Department and USAID operations that protect Americans overseas and advance our diplomatic and economic interests around the globe. We must begin to undo the damage to the State Department and USAID wrought by the Trump administration and ensure that both agencies have the resources to deal with the effects of COVID-19, including the impacts on our Foreign Service officers and their families, embassy operations, and lost revenue due to disruption of services, even as we look to replenish and revive these critical instruments for our national security. So, Mr. President, I'll end where I begin. We cannot hermetically seal ourselves and believe that we can avoid any consequences from any place across the globe. Disease, including this one, knows no boundaries, knows no borders. Unless and until COVID-19 is stamped out globally, American lives and livelihoods remain at risk. Simply put, our international efforts to stop the spread of COVID-19 abroad are directly linked to our national and economic security at home. So I urge all of my colleagues to support continued relief, recovery, and prevention efforts by voting in support of the budget resolution. And I yield the floor to my distinguished colleague, fellow senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Card.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, first, let me thank Chairman Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for his advocacy in getting into this budget resolution the $10 billion for the global response to COVID-19. And I just want to underscore what Chairman Menendez said from the beginning. This global response will not only save lives around the world, it will save lives here at home. In 1 year, 450,000 Americans have lost their life to COVID-19, 2.6 million worldwide. The United States has the distinction of having the largest number of fatalities and infections of any country in the world. This is a challenge that requires the leadership of the United States of America. If we're going to beat COVID-19, America must be in the leadership to do this as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So what does that require? It requires us to take the right steps at home, and the budget resolution before us gives us the resources to do that with the production and distribution, fair distribution of vaccines, and dealing with the needs for testing, dealing for the needs of those businesses and individuals that have been directly affected by COVID-19. All that is dealt with in this package. But we also need to work responsibly in the global community. And that's what this $10 billion will allow us to do, to be leaders globally as well as what we do at home. President Biden has already taken the initial steps by rejoining the World Health Organization and joining the COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access Facility, so that 190 countries in the world, we can join together to make sure that everyone gets access to this vaccine, particularly in low and middle income countries that otherwise will be challenged. Why? Because that's our values, humanitarian concerns globally. But it's also in our individual interest, because if this virus is not contained in a country, it will get to the United States. And as Chairman Menendez says, the longer this vaccine goes, the longer this virus goes globally, the more variants we're going to see, and the tougher it's going to be for us to be able to control the COVID-19 around the world and in the United States of America. 104 million infections globally. This is a global pandemic and requires a global response. And this budget resolution gives us the wherewithal in order to do that. And as Senator Menendez has pointed out, it's not only to deal with the direct eradication of the virus, which we have to do, but the consequences of the virus and world poverty and hunger and those issues that are important for the United States to lead the global community in dealing with the aftermath of this terrible virus. So, Mr. President, I just really wanted to come to the floor to underscore there's so many reasons to support this budget resolution, but the one that I just really wanted to underscore today is that we are not only dealing with the issues at home, we're being responsible citizens of the world, leading by example and leading by engagement, which will help the health care of the people in America and our national security. And with that, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator for South Carolina.
Thank you. I'm going to start off
Would
the
the senator
process
like
today.
to dispense with the quorum call?
Yes, unanimous consent to do that.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you very much. So as I understand, Senator Sanders will come after I speak. I'll talk 10 or 15 minutes, then we'll get on with the process of voting. So to the American people who may be watching, what is this all about? This is an effort by my Democratic colleagues, supported by President Biden, to pass $1.9 trillion in COVID relief through a budget process that requires only 50 votes. It goes around the idea of bipartisanship. And I would say this, I think all of us would like unity. I think President Biden has said all the right things at his inauguration. The question is, are we going to do more than talk about unity? I can understand having reconciliation used for Obamacare, for taxes. Y'all did that, we did that, big philosophical differences. But this is the one area that there was bipartisanship up until recently. This is the one area where the Congress has been able to work together across party lines, and that's providing relief to the American people who have been long suffering under the COVID pandemic. So I find it odd that if our goal is unity, we start with the issue that has been unified up until now. That's what is a bit perplexing, because it's not like the Republican Party can't work with the Democratic Party to help the American people when it comes to COVID relief. We had a Republican president, a Democratic-controlled House, and a Republican Senate. For the last year, we've appropriated $4 trillion in COVID relief for the American people, working together. So when there was divided government, a Republican president, a Democratic-controlled House, and a Republican-controlled Senate, we're able to achieve bipartisanship in large measure, dealing with a lot of money, because we saw the problem as something worthy of bipartisanship, necessary for bipartisanship, and COVID was affecting everybody, regardless of your political persuasion. Now we find ourselves, early on in the Biden administration, abandoning that model and going forward on a partisan effort to spend $1.9 trillion with one party alone without really input from the other party. So on March 5th, 2020, we approved an $8 billion supplemental appropriation, 96-1. In March, we're just beginning to understand the nature of the COVID problem. We shut the country down pretty much in March. And as things become more clear to us, we acted, I think, responsibly. March 18th, just a couple of weeks later, we approved 98-8, $355 billion package to help families that were affected by COVID. March 25th, just about a week later, we spent $1.9 trillion in a COVID relief package, which is a massive amount of money, one of the largest expenditures in the history of the country since World War II, 96-0. So we're now talking about spending $1.9 trillion in February of 2021, and there seems to be no ability here to negotiate a package that could get another 90-plus votes, because my Democratic colleagues have chosen the reconciliation route. April 21st, 2020, by voice vote, we spent $355 billion to add more money to the Paycheck Protection Act that Senator Collins and the presiding officer worked on to help businesses who had lost their customer base. September the 30th, we had $8 billion, 84-10. December the 21st, 2020, we did an omnibus bill of $1.4 trillion funding the government, and we had money for COVID in that package, about $900 billion. That passed 92-6. That was in Christmas. Here's what I want you to understand. that we have up to now been able to work together to help the American people who have been suffering from COVID. We've appropriated, as I've just described, over $4 trillion. And as of this moment, 2.7 have actually been allocated. So there's over $1 trillion, 1.3 trillion that we haven't spent yet. Of the $900 billion we authorized to be spent, appropriated in December, only 20% of it's been spent. So a lot of the money is yet to be spent, and now we're going to add 1.9 trillion on top of what we've done before all the money's been spent, or most of it's been spent. We created a Federal Reserve program for mid-size and larger businesses that had a $5.7 trillion cap on it. We've done 2.6 trillion. So I think people on our side really believe that we should learn more about how the money's being spent we've already appropriated, that a $15 minimum wage increase in a COVID package is a bad idea during a COVID economy, and that's what's in this package. Most small businesses in South Carolina and throughout the country have been struggling to stay open due to lack of travel, due to mandates at the state and local, reducing the ability to have 100% occupancy in restaurants. Tourism has really been hurt. The service sector has really been hurt. The food industry has really been hurt. Can you imagine the combined effect of having the government reduce your ability to earn money by restricting your business model, and at the same time adding a mandate to your business of maybe increasing your wages by 50%, maybe 100%? So this 1-2 punch will take out what's left of small businesses in the tourism sector and in the restaurant business. Because what we've had to do, some people say we've done too much in restricting the ability of small businesses to earn a living, but that's had an effect on their ability to generate income. Now we're combining an increase in cost of increasing wages for every business in the country to $15 an hour over time. They can't absorb that. A lot of us believe that is the wrong thing to do in a COVID economy. Maybe one day we can talk about a minimum wage increase when business can get back on its feet. But that's one of the reasons that you're going to find pretty much unified opposition on our side. So I just want the American people to know it's one thing to talk about unity, it's another thing to seek it. And you pick the one issue that we've been able to find common ground. Why you pick this, I don't know, but you have. I appreciate President Biden sitting down with 10 Republicans who wanted to find an alternative. A lot of people believe that in this package, the direct payments go to people who really are not going to spend the money because they haven't lost their job and they're making over $150,000 to $200,000 plus as a couple, that we should target direct stimulus checks to people in the lower income areas who've suffered the most. So there's a lot of concern about the nature of the $1.9 trillion package. Details do matter, but I would just say this. I can understand having a fight about health care, about taxes, but when it comes to COVID relief, we've been able in the last year to find bipartisanship for $4 trillion. And now we're abandoning that quest, and we're going to try to create a process, my Democratic colleagues are, to deal us all out on our side and pass a $1.9 trillion COVID package that I think in many ways misses the mark. So to say that I'm disappointed is an understatement. You have the right to do this. And during the campaign, we talked about what would happen if one party got in charge of everything. We predicted on the Republican side, if you have a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House, that the liberal wish list is going to come roaring through the House and the Senate trying to get on President Biden's desk. To President Biden's credit, I think he ran a campaign that was more centrist, but now he has a chance as President of the United States to stand down this process and continue to talk with the Republicans, which I think there are more than 10, that would like to find an alternative to a $1.9 trillion package that we think misses the mark and is being appropriated when we haven't spent most of the money we've already appropriated. So this is a choice you make. This is a debate we're going to have. It's going to be a long day. It will go into the night. Let's try to keep good cheer about it. Understand that we all love the country. But these kind of debates are important, and the choices you make as a party will have to accept responsibility for the choices that we all make. And I would just urge my Democratic colleagues, this is one area where I've been relatively proud of the Congress. We've spent an enormous amount of money in a bipartisan fashion. Some of the most conservative members of the Senate have been voting on pretty large amounts of money because I think, generally speaking, it's been necessary. But now the vaccine is being distributed. Anything we can do to get it out faster to more people, great. Most of the money we've appropriated hasn't been spent. I would just ask that we slow down a bit. Whatever we spend in the future needs to be more targeted. And the last thing you want to do in a COVID economy is increase the cost of doing business at a time most businesses are barely hanging on in certain sectors of the economy. So I look forward to working with Senator Sanders, trying to work through the amendments. And this will be a long day, but hopefully it will be a fruitful day for the American people as you understand more about the differences that we have, and eventually maybe we can find something in common. If you asked me before the election, what are the two areas that bipartisanship would be easiest achieved, most likely to be achieved? Infrastructure, because we all have roads and bridges and ports, and COVID. So I was wrong about the COVID part, and time will tell if it matters at all. So with that, I will yield to my friend and colleague, the chairman of the committee, Senator Sanders.
Let me thank my colleague from South Carolina, and I look forward to him. He's going to be the ranking member of the Budget Committee. Got a lot of work to do, and I look forward to working with him. As Senator Graham indicated, in a few moments, at the end of my remarks, we are going to begin the vote-a-rama process, where senators can offer amendments with debate limited to 2 minutes, 1 minute for the proponents and 1 minute for the opponents. The last time I checked, I may be a little behind the times on this, my Republican colleagues have filed over 550 amendments, which theoretically means that we'll be here for days, but I think not. I have the feeling it'll be a very long night, but I assume we will get out of here at some point. Unfortunately, many of the amendments being offered have absolutely nothing to do with COVID relief, which, after all, is what this budget resolution is all about. My Republican colleagues have filed amendments to make President Trump's tax breaks to the wealthiest people in our country and the most profitable corporations permanent, which would provide a massive windfall to the top 1% and the billionaire class, who have already seen their wealth go up by over $1 trillion during this pandemic. To my mind, not exactly the kind of policy that we need right now. Republicans have filed amendments to exacerbate the xenophobia which exists in this country, despite the fact that many undocumented workers are doing some of the most essential and dangerous work in our country. They're working in meatpacking plants, they're preparing our food and working on the front lines, often with very low pay. We should not be attacking them. We should not be dividing this country up. We should be bringing our people together. We've had 4 years of efforts to divide us up, now is a time for unity. Members of the Democratic Caucus have made my life easy in this process because they have filed 0 amendments. Republicans, 550 amendments, Democrats, 0. And I think that speaks to the strong desire of our entire caucus to pass President Biden's $1.9 trillion emergency COVID relief plan as soon as we possibly can. And the reason we have got to pass that plan as quickly as possible is that the American people are suffering one crisis after another. And we have got to address those crises as quickly as we can. Let me briefly, I know there's a lot of media talk about 1.9 trillion and this, that, and the other thing. Sometimes we forget to look at actually what is in the proposal. What are we trying to do? What are the problems that we're trying to address? So let me just very briefly touch on some of the provisions of this budget resolution. First, and perhaps most importantly, it will enable us to aggressively crush the pandemic, which has already taken over 450,000 American lives. That is our top priority. Crush the pandemic and allow people to get back to work as we reopen and strengthen the economy and we get our kids back to school. And that is an essential part of what this resolution is about. This resolution will allow us to provide the funding to establish a national emergency program to produce the quantity of vaccines that we need. We don't have enough vaccines now. We need more, and then we need a process, which we don't have right now either, to get those vaccines into the arms of people as quickly as we possibly can. Mr. President, at a time when so many of our people are hurting, have gone through the worst year in their lives as a result of this pandemic, this budget resolution will allow us to keep the promises we made to the American people and increase the $600 in direct payments for working class adults and their children to $2,000. That means $1,400 for every working class adult and child in this country. An additional $5,600 on top of the $600 that we sent out a few weeks ago. Do you know what that will mean to millions of families who are worried about whether they can pay the rent or put food on the table? They will understand that maybe, just maybe, we are one country and the government and this Congress has heard their pain. Passing this budget resolution will give us the tools we need to raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour and provide substantial help to struggling small businesses to help them cover the cost of these wage increases. We do understand that restaurants and small businesses are hurting, and that is why we will provide billions of dollars to help them cover the cost of increasing the minimum wage. Well, let us be clear. The minimum wage in this country has not been raised since the year 2007. It now stands at $7.25 an hour. That is a starvation wage. That is an embarrassment, and that minimum wage must be increased so that we can give a pay raise to some 32 million workers. Moreover, Mr. President, this pandemic has caused tens of millions of Americans to lose their jobs through no fault of their own. For 45 consecutive weeks, unemployment claims have been higher during the worst week of the Great Recession in 2008. The budget resolution that we are considering this week will provide the funding to provide 18 million Americans with $400 a week in supplemental unemployment benefits until the end of September. So we're saying now to the millions and millions of unemployed workers in this country who, through no fault of their own, have lost their jobs, we are there for you. We're going to extend unemployment benefits to September and add another $400 on top of the benefits that you normally would receive. Mr. President, one of the disgraces that we have allowed to go on for so many years and not talk about it is the fact that in this country, the richest country in the history of the world, we have one of the highest childhood poverty rates of any industrialized country. And they're all over America. You got single moms, couples, people trying to take care of their kids, trying to pay for childcare, trying to do all the things that good parents want to do, and they're unable to do it. This budget resolution will provide the resources necessary to provide childcare to 875,000 kids in America. This resolution will expand the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 and $3,600 for kids under the age of 6, which, Mr. President, we believe will cut the child poverty rate in America in half, something we should have done 20 years ago. But that is what is in this resolution. This budget resolution that we're debating today would provide $350 billion to prevent mass layoffs of public sector workers in state and local governments. We've lost well over 1 million jobs, talking about teachers, firemen, cops, municipal workers. And this resolution will give states and local government the resources to not lay off workers, to bring those workers back so they can provide the services that their communities and states require. Mr. President, we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a human right. And right now, over 90 million Americans are either uninsured or underinsured. Imagine being uninsured in the midst of a terrible pandemic. That's the case, 90 million people. This budget resolution will enable the Senate to substantially increase access to health care for many millions of Americans, including, very likely, a significant expansion of Medicaid. This budget resolution will allow more Americans to receive the primary health care they need through community health centers. It will address the serious shortage of doctors and nurses in rural areas and inner cities by expanding the National Health Service Corps, and it will make sure that our veterans receive the health care they have earned and deserve by increasing funding at the VA by some $17 billion. In addition, Mr. President, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, I don't think it is saying too much that people should not go hungry. And I, get emotionally wrought when in my own state, and this is true in every state in this country, in my own city of Burlington, Vermont, hundreds of people lined up in their cars to get emergency food packages. Many of them never in a million years would have thought that they would be in that position. We are looking at the highest rate of hunger in America in decades. And if this country means anything, if this government means anything, we are not going to allow our fellow Americans to go hungry. This budget resolution will provide nutrition assistance to tens of millions of hungry families with children, the disabled, and the elderly by providing billions of dollars for SNAP, WIC, and the Pandemic Nutrition Assistance Program. Mr. President, one of the outstanding crises this country faces is the fear of many millions of our people of being evicted from their homes or their apartments. Today, over 14 million Americans owe an average of $5,800 in back rent. We have a moratorium on eviction right now. But the day that moratorium ends, I fear that many, many people all over this country will face eviction. And that is why this budget resolution will provide the funding for rent relief, utility assistance, and mortgage relief to millions of tenants and homeowners who are in danger of eviction or foreclosure. In addition, this budget resolution allows us to address the terrible crisis of homelessness in America, where a few blocks away from here, in bitter cold weather, Americans are sleeping out in tents. Mr. President, not only is this $1.9 trillion emergency COVID relief package the right thing to do, from a moral perspective and a public policy perspective, it is exactly what the overwhelming majority of the American people want us to do. They understand that if we are one country and they are hurting, now is the time to come together and to address that pain. So many of our people have given up on democracy. They've given up on their belief that government can work to help them. Now is the time to try to reaffirm people's faith in government. People want us to go forward. According to a recent poll, over 70% of the American people support President Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID-19 plan. 83% support boosting direct payments from $600 to $2,000. 64% support raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, and 62% support additional unemployment benefits. In other words, what we are doing is the right thing to do, and what we are doing is what the American people want us to do. So now is the time to reaffirm the faith of the American people that their government listens to them, that in fact we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Lincoln talked about in the midst of the terrible Civil War. So now we can show who we are, and that is, instead of listening to wealthy campaign contributors and all of the lobbyists who flood Capitol Hill, let us stand with working families today, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor, who want us to stand with them. Let us pass this budget resolution, and let us then finish the job by passing a reconciliation bill so that we can get it to the president for his signature as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and with that, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
That sounds good to me.
Mr. President,
The senator from Vermont.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection,
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be in order to be called up in the order listed. Wicker Cinema, number 261. Tim Scott, number 53. Rubio Scott, number 69. Blunt, number 48. Thune, number 52. Young, number 54. Further, that there be 2 minutes for debate equally divided in the usual form prior to each vote.
is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President,
The senator from Arizona is recognized.
I call up amendment number 261 on behalf of Senator Wicker and myself and ask that it be reported by number.
Without objection. The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, for Mr. Wicker, proposes an amendment number 261.
Mr. President, I yield back both time on all sides.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The question's on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Cinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blunt, Cornyn, Kramer, Durbin, Graham, Hassan, Inhofe, Kelly, King, Murray, Ossoff, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Warner, and Whitehouse. Mr. Paul voted in the negative. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. No. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Lankford, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Murky, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. These are. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murky? Yeah, I do. There. And this, we have to go. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 90, the nays are 10, and the amendment is agreed to.
Madam President, could I have some order, Madam President?
The Senate will be in order.
I ask consent I be allowed to speak for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, as the Senate proceeds today on its long string of roll call votes, I rise at this moment to note that this vote is different than the rest. One of our most beloved, effective members has just cast her 9,000th roll call vote in the course of her career. Senator Murray, congratulations. It's a history-making accomplishment from a truly history-making public servant, and I would like, in the efforts that we're all going to speed this darn thing up, I ask unanimous consent that the rest of my remarks be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam
Yield
President.
the floor.
Madam President.
Wait.
Madam
Oh,
President.
there I see you. Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I call up my amendment number 53 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number, please.
The senator from South Carolina, Mr. Scott, proposes an amendment numbered 53.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, as of last month, 2 out of every 5 COVID-related deaths in this country are either residents of nursing homes or the staff of nursing homes. Inaccurate information affects life and death decisions for communities.
Senate will be in order, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Requiring states to provide accurate data is common sense for anyone who believes, as I do, that we should have a science-based, fact-driven response to this pandemic. We should not offer more funding to states that have mismanaged and then covered up their pandemic response until they fix it. It simply makes no sense. That is why my colleagues should join me in supporting this amendment.
Who yields time in opposition?
Madam President,
The senator from Pennsylvania.
I have great respect for my colleague from South Carolina. We're going to serve together on the Aging Committee, leading the committee. I oppose this amendment for some basic reasons. Number one is he cited the number of deaths in long-term care facilities across the country. More than 150,000 people are dead in long-term care. The last administration didn't even count those deaths until May of 2020, despite efforts by members of this body to urge the administration to do that. They never had a plan. They didn't help the states. This is an effort, an ongoing effort, to blame states when the federal government dropped the ball when it came to long-term care. I think we can do better than that. We should be helping nursing homes with the resources they need, like resources for cohorting. You can separate a resident with COVID-19 from those that don't have it. We should be providing money for strike teams and ways to help nursing homes. Let's reduce the deaths instead of pointing fingers.
Expired.
Madam President, I believe
Senator
I
for South
reserved some.
Carolina.
Madam President, how much time do I have left on my 60 seconds?
Senator has 5 seconds.
That much. Okay, great. I look forward to working with Senator Casey on the committee. He is a person that I have great respect for. I would simply say that the responsibility are the governors of these states to report accurate information. This is not a political debate.
Time has expired.
Thank you.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Arono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Cassidy, Collins, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Young. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Coons, Duckworth, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kelly, King, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Sinema, Tester, Van Hollen, Warnock, Whitehouse, Wyden. Ms. Smith, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Markey, no. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker. Aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Leahy, no. Ms. Warren, no. Cortez Masto, Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye.
On this amendment, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam President,
The senator from Florida.
I call up my amendment number 69 and ask that it be
Regular order, please. The Senate will be in order. Thank you.
I call up my amendment number 69 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Florida, Mr. Rubio, for himself and others, proposes an amendment numbered 69.
The Senate will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Senator from Florida.
This amendment simply says you can't raise taxes on small business during the pandemic, and I hope everyone can support it. I can't imagine anyone being against that idea. I yield. And ask for the yeas and nays.
Yield back here. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. Recognize the senator from Vermont.
Madam Chair, there are no tax increases on small business in this proposal.
The Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Thank you.
Madam Chair, there are no taxes in this proposal. We support the Rubio amendment.
Does the senator want to yield back time?
Yeah, we yield back time. We support a voice vote.
All time is yielded back. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call.
We already have the yeas and nays ordered.
President,
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask consent that the roll call be dispensed with and we use a voice vote. Vitiated.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question is on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Is there sufficient second? There is. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Brasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Deans, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Harone, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Kane, Kelly, Langford, Leahy, Lujan, Lummis, Manchin, Marshall, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Paul, Portman, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Sinema, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye.
The yeas are 100. The nays are 0. The amendment is agreed to.
Okay. Madam President,
The senator from Kentucky.
I ask
We have
unanimous,
order, please.
I ask unanimous consent that the subsequent votes be 10 minutes in duration.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I would like to ask Senator Paul in front of everybody to start wearing a mask on the Senate floor, like the entire staff does all the time, particularly the staff that I appreciate now, the presiding officer wearing a mask, but I wish Senator Paul would show the respect to his colleagues to wear a mask when he's on the Senate floor, walking around and speaking.
Is there objection
I
to the
withdraw my
request?
objection.
Is there objection to the request from the senator from Kentucky?
Without objection.
It was withdrawn. Thank you.
Madam President,
The senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I call up my amendment number 48 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report by number.
The senator from Missouri, Mr. Blunt, proposes an amendment numbered 48.
I'm offering an amendment today to reopen our nation's schools once.
Order. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, President. I'm offering an amendment today to reopen our nation's schools once teachers are vaccinated and the potential of tying COVID funding to that reopening. The evidence is clear. School closures are hurting students. Prolonged remote learning puts kids where they are at high risk of falling behind, of failing classes, of having mental health problems, and even a greater number of students with disabilities and underserved areas are
Please
impacted
take your conversations off the floor.
by not going to school. Science confirms schools can and should reopen safely. Just this week, the CDC director said that vaccines aren't even a prerequisite to getting kids back to school. There shouldn't be any further delay. This amendment does include for teachers vaccines as one of the criteria, but with vaccines, we should get back to in-person school. The case is strong. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment.
The senator from Washington.
Madam President, the role of federal funding to schools for COVID relief is to help support our schools in implementing public health protocols aligned with local public health guidance in order to safely reopen. The President has made clear he would like the vast majority of K-8 schools to reopen in the next 100 days. But any amendment offered today attaching extraneous conditions to those funds is simply a political show. If we withhold funds and schools cannot implement health safety protocols, then we are acting counter to actually getting students back into the classroom. Making sure our nation's educators receive a vaccine is an important step. However, vaccinations are just one piece of safely transitioning back. Safely reopening schools means providing schools the resources to implement public health protocols, physical distancing, consistent masking wearing, ventilation, testing, contact tracing. This amendment would prohibit schools from getting critical resources to implement those public health protocols. And as a result, this amendment would make that much harder for schools to reopen for in-person instruction. The best way for our schools to reopen as soon as possible is to
Senator's
give
time
schools
has
the
expired.
resources they need. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Additional time. Any
The senator
additional-
has 2 seconds.
Vote yes on this amendment.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Hall, Portman, Risch, Romney, Round, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, Young. Mr. Cotton, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kelly, King, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. This is the original. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed. No. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Durbin. No. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Carper. You're not? Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye.
The yeas are yes, the nays are no. The amendment is not. Oh, I thought it said. No. The yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to. The senator from South Dakota is recognized.
That my amendment number 52 be called up as modified, supported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from South Dakota, Mr. Thune, proposes an amendment numbered 52 as modified.
Mr. President, one significant thing we could do to provide genuine relief to Americans is to address the tax situation facing remote and mobile workers. Like the medical professionals who traveled to other states to help during the COVID crisis, and now may be facing a surprise big fat tax bill. Mobile workers generally have to file tax returns in multiple states whose tax rules often differ. And with COVID, many employers had their employees begin working from home, presenting a possible tax problem for workers who live in a different state than the one they work in. This amendment, Mr. President, would address these challenges. It would create a uniform standard for mobile workers, codify the pre-pandemic status quo for remote workers, and establish a special 90-day standard for healthcare workers and others who travel to another state to help during the pandemic and to ensure that these workers don't face an unexpected tax bill. Mr. President, I would ask that we adopt the amendment.
Mr. President.
Recognize the senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my friend for the senior senator from South Dakota for working with me on this. We've been working on this for a full decade now. We've worked together in the Ag Committee to deliver for America's farmers. I want to take the same approach here. Healthcare workers, as my friend from South Dakota said, have been on the front lines of this pandemic going on for a year now. Not only are they combating this virus in their own community, many of them have traveled across state lines, obviously, to do this. A surprise bill, a tax bill, is the last thing they need. We should make it easier for these mobile workers to support themselves and their family. This is important to a lot of my colleagues, Senator Hassan, Senator Shaheen, Senator Cortez Masto, and I just talked about it. I thank all of you for working to make this progress possible.
From Ohio, and I would ask that this amendment be adopted by voice.
The question is on the amendment. All in favor, let it known by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
I call amendment number 54 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Indiana, Mr. Young, for himself and Mr. Cotton, proposes an amendment numbered 54.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of my amendment to ensure that any new round of economic impact payments does not go to those in this country illegally. It would establish a dangerous precedent if the federal government were to give a direct cash payment to those who have jumped the line and subverted our nation's immigration system to enter the United States. Now, I want to emphasize that this amendment is not a change. It's not a change from the way this body has approached EIPs during the last two rounds. Moreover, it does not affect the important fix that Congress implemented with the leadership of Mr. Rubio in December to ensure mixed status families are not negatively impacted. This amendment would simply make certain that Democrats do not loosen the existing eligibility requirements moving forward if there's a new round of EIPs.
Mr. President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, let me clarify something at the outset. Undocumented immigrants do not qualify for stimulus relief under current law or any proposal by the Biden administration. This amendment is unnecessary. There are estimated to be 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, 7.5 million I-10s. These are men and women working in the United States, paying federal taxes, living in this country. We can save the debate for another day as to their entitlement for any financial relief. But let me hope that we do agree on one basic thing. Children who are legal citizens in the United States of America are entitled to help regardless of the immigration status of their parents. Unfortunately, Senator Young's amendment as written would preclude these children of immigrant parents from this financial assistance. Whether you're for or against their parents receiving a payment, be fair to these American children, these legal citizens in the United States, and vote no on the Young Amendment.
Mr. President, how much time do I have to respond?
5 seconds.
We have consulted with legal counsel. The gentleman from Illinois' statements, assertions are inaccurate. This would not impact mixed status families. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote aye for this amendment.
I have any time remaining?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Hassan, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Kelly, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Manchin, Marshall, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Peters, Rounds, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sinema, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Romney, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cardin, Harper, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. No. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. No. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Cantwell. Miss Cantwell. Mr. Haggerty. Aye. Miss Collins. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. No.
Hello, my name is Kathy, and
Mr.
I
Bennett.
am
Mr.
the
Bennett.
founder of the National
No.
Outreach. You are watching the Senate live floor proceeding. This stream will end at around 4:20 p.m. CDT. The stream will be concluded by itself. The Senate live proceeding will continue, and you can find those on the
Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey. Aye.
Hi, I'm sorry, it's Kathleen again. This stream is actually going to be ending right now due to low bitrate resolutions. Thanks for listening in. Make sure to check